Hello and welcome to Core Basics Coding Tutorial. This video is really about exceptions part 2. If you have not seen my video on exceptions, I highly recommend watching it. You can watch it by clicking on this link. In this video, we are going to cover 3 topics: how to raise standard exception, how to raise a user-defined exception, and a finally keyword. So let's begin with how to raise standard exception. Now, you all know that generally you put your code that you want to protect in try except block, and if you want to raise an exception within your code, then you will use a raise statement. And to raise a standard exception, you can type in the standard exception name. Now you can just Google Python built-in exception to see a list of them. I know that memory error is one of the exceptions, so you can just say memory error here and accept memory error as E, print E. When you run this, it will say memory error. So this is how you raise the exception. You use raise keyword followed by the exception class name and the argument in the constructor. Now all of these classes are derived from a generic class called exception. So you can use generic class exception as well. However, it's a recommended practice to use specific exception type. This will work, but you want to use a specific exception so that you can handle it in an appropriate way. Okay, now how about I want to raise my own user-defined exception. I don't want to use this standard exception memory error. Now the exceptions in Python are actually the instance of classes. So to define your own exception, you need to define a class. Okay, so I'm going to erase this code, or rather I'll just push it down, and I'm going to now define my own class for the exception. Now remember, whenever you define your own class for exception, let's say my exception class is accident, you have to derive it from exception based class. Now if you have watched my inheritance video on Python, this is how you derive a class from another class. So accident is derived from exception class. Okay, and we are going to just put something in the constructor saying message. Message is really your exception message. Okay, and I'll say print exception. Here I'm just defining a method to print an exception. User, here you can see user define exception, and what do you want to print here? The message. The exception message is something that you want to print here. So you just define a user defined exception class. Now to raise it, you can just say raise accident. Okay, and let's say accident occurred between two cars, so you'll say crash between two cars. Okay, and this guy here will be accident. E dot print exception. When you run this, it will print user defined exception crash between two cars. So now if you remember from our exception original example, exceptions are nothing but unusual scenarios that happen when you are executing your code. So for example, you are driving your car, that's like, and you don't see, your road is clear, you don't see anything unusual. That is like executing code without exception. But one fine day you see an accident and the whole road is blocked. So that scenario is called an exception occurred, and you need to handle it. So handling the that particular case is basically taking a detour so that you can eventually reach your destination. So in programming also, you have to do the same thing. If unusual thing happens, you need to find a way to handle it and still complete the execution of code. So that's why I use the accident example. Let's say in this try block, I was just driving my car and I saw an accident. So I will raise accident exception, and here I may just handle it. So for example, instead of printing, I could have done accident.handle, and this will be my take. So I'll say accident, yeah. I will just print accident occurred, take detour, okay, and this will be e.handle. When you run this, it is saying that accident occurred when I was driving, hence take the detour. If accident didn't occur, then you don't need to do it. Okay, one final thing we are going to cover is finally statement. Now, finally is something that people use to do cleanup. So, for example, let's say I have a function which is processing a file. So I'm just going to copy paste the function to save time on recording. This function opens this file and it does some processing with it. And then in the code block, I have this instruction. So imagine you have a huge code block and somewhere you are dividing a number by 0. Now, sometimes, the code blocks are bigger, so you may not consciously realize that you have a potential of exception happening somewhere in your code. So you will just handle the known exception. So you know that you are opening the file, so you will write an exception handling for file not found error. But you may not, let's say you forget to type this in, okay? And what happens is usually when you're opening a file, you will close the file, right? So you will say, okay, close the file. And when you call this function here, now let's see what happens. So when I run this, it will first open the file, and on my computer the file exists, so this will work fine. But when it comes here, it will raise this exception. Now I'm not handling division by 0 exception here. That's why it is just abnormally terminating from this point. It is not reaching f.close statement. Now remember, f.close will close the file and it will do necessary cleanup of file resources. So it is very important to do f.close, but in this case it's not happening. So how do I handle it? So first use case is you need to handle basically your division by 0 error, right? Okay, this will work, but this will only work if you know all possible exceptions that may happen in this code block. This code block, which is 2 lines here, might be 1000 lines, and it's impossible to figure out all the exceptions here. So the way to solve this problem is use the finally keyword. So what finally will do is, first let me show you. So I'm going to use this. Okay, f.close. So I'm going to just print that I'm cleaning up file. Okay, when I run this, let's check what happens. So it still had this exception, but watch this, cleaning up the file. So even if the exception happens in try except block and there is no handling of that exception, it will still go into finally and it will clean up the file handle. So finally is pretty useful here in this case, where basically inside your try except block, if you want to do some cleanup, for example, here I'm opening the file, so definitely I want to close the file. If you want to do that cleanup, you can do it in finally, and it is ensured that it will execute no matter what. Okay, so that was all about raising exceptions and finally keyword. Thank you for watching.